So this is a Lotus 41C. It started out, 41s were in Europe predominantly a Formula Junior and Formula 3, and then later they put twin cam engine in it, and it became a Formula 2 car. When it came to the States, the Lotus 41 was primarily used in Formula B here in the States with the twin cam. And then they upgraded the wheels and tires and everything else for the Formula B and Formula 2 in Europe. So there's, in all, 61 Lotus 41s are made. So this particular chassis is the last one to have ever come out of Lotus components, which was at that time. So it is fairly original. I discovered the car in a barn. Blame one of our club members for actually finding out about it. That was Dan Wise. And Dan had a co-worker that said, happened to mention to him, I have an old Formula car in my barn. Well, his barn turned out to be a 40-foot trailer. And in it was an Austin, and then this was tucked underneath the Austin. It was completely original at the time, so it was unpainted. It was in white gel coat, completely pristine. Had very few miles on it. If miles really mean anything on a race car, because what he had done was he had 2 or 3 of these 41s that he bought from Lotus, and he actually had a race team with 2 cars that raced, and then this was the 3rd car, the T car. It didn't have an engine and tranny in it at the time when he bought it, and it never really was raced during the late 60s and early 70s. So eventually he had a nephew that said, I want to race it, Uncle. So they built the car up in the late 70s, early 80s, and the kid raced 3 times in the car, and I think he scared himself enough that he said he didn't want to race anymore. And then I discovered the car with the help of Dan in about 1995 or so, and we pulled it out of the barn, or out of the trailer container, and dragged it home, and we promptly took it apart to do a total restoration on it. And so then I vintage raced it for about 10 years, and then had a big wreck in Sears Point, and bent the car up good enough that we had to put a new chassis in it, replace most of the left side suspension was replaced, and had to paint the body because it was damaged enough that I had in the repair that to make it look good again, we painted it instead of leaving it in gel coat. But it is, the gel coat was white, so we repainted it in white and then put for now, a blue stripe on it. So the plan is to get it back on the track, and I hope we can do that in the next few months. So this is a 1966 Series 2 Elan. I am particularly fond of Series 2 Elans for a number of reasons. One is they're drop dead beautiful from I think they're a gorgeous car. But a couple other things cosmetically that I really liked was it didn't have a lot of fender flare. It had a nice clean body. The later ones had a different fender flare and a different arch. And then the bigger thing is on Series 3 and Series 4 Elans, they have the window hoop. And then they also had a cutout back here because they all started out as coupes or fixed heads, and this is a drop head. These were made a little bit differently in body. So I just liked the looks of the Series 2. They looked lighter, looked daintier. This particular car I bought from, actually again belonged to one of our club members, Jerry Baszler. And Jerry subsequently sold it to another guy. It had a dash fire in it. And so when I bought the car, it had been completely taken apart. Every nut and bolt had been was in a baggie. The body was at a body shop being restored and getting ready for paint. And so it was another one of those restoration puppies that we bring home. And they did a roundup on it. Did some reinforcing on the chassis. Doing some just minor modifications to make the car more reliable. And then we put the Panasport wheels on it. And the kind of interesting story in the Panasport wheels is I worked with the company back a long time ago when I was selling Lotus wheels and wheels for Lotuses in the I was looking. People always wanted an alloy knock-on for the Elans, and could never find any at that time. So I contacted Formula Mag, who's a company that makes panel sports, and helped them design a wheel for the Elan. So there you have it. This is, I can't believe it, this car is actually going to be 10 years old this year. Because I bought the car, we bought the car in, we got titled for the car in early September of 2004. It's 2014. I had wanted an Elise, and the folks back at Lotus Cars USA kept on asking me, you know, do you want one, do you want one, do you want one? And then I said, I don't know, but then they said, I was in Atlanta one time, and before the Elise had come out, and they had a prototype there, one of the early cars with the Toyota engine. They said, okay, go take this for a drive, you tell us if you want one or not. So that was probably the worst thing they could have done, because of course, anytime somebody hands you keys and you go for a drive, and it's in a fantastic car like the Elise, you come back with a big grin and you're ready to probably sell your first one. So I did say I wanted a car, and I said, well, how do we do this? And they just said, well, we know you want a car, so just when it comes time, just let us know, and we'll make sure we get one arranged. Okay. So I hadn't had an interesting list. I had a red car, we had white cars, I had black cars, I had green cars. I hadn't had a blue sports car. So I said, blues, yeah, we gotta have a blue car now. So we ordered the Mag Blue, or told them we want Mag Blue. Opted for the tan interior, biscuit interior, and I wanted the sports suspension. So they called me a couple weeks later, said, okay, we got a press car coming, it's gonna arrive in late July, early August, probably '04. It so happened that the Lotus Owner Gathering by Lotus Limited was going to be taking place in Birmingham that September, or early October of that year. So the marketing manager at the time, Mark O'Shaughnessy, made a suggestion and said, well, why don't we keep the car here instead of shipping it back to California? Why don't we keep the car here? You guys fly out, take the car to Birmingham for the log, and then bring it back. So that's what we did. We bought the car, paid for the car here in California, flew to Atlanta, sort of took delivery. I was asked to do my own PDI. That's the pre-delivery inspection. That was entertaining. And then drove the car to Birmingham with the Atlanta Lotus Club. And then we drove around parts of Tennessee and South Carolina. Drove the infamous Dragon, and then took it back to Lotus Cars USA. And then they shipped it out to California in October, where it went through a real PDI. And then one of the things I had done while we were at Lotus Cars USA, Tony Shute happened to be there, and Tony was the chief product manager, project manager for the Elise, which was called Croft at the time. And so I had Tony autograph the car. So under that little panel right there is Tony Schute's signature. So this 7 has an interesting story. I acquired this 7 probably, trying to think of what year it was, 1980-ish or so. We drug it home on a trailer, much to the demise of Laura. And then we did a ground-up restoration on it. And that's pretty well documented actually on our website. So all the skin and everything else got taken off. There was quite a bit of rust in the chassis, so I replaced a lot of the tubes. And then I did a lot of research, talked to a number of the guys that had campaigned these things and raced them and autocrossed them, and also looked at a lot of the stuff that Caterham had done. So there was a lot of extra gusseting that went into the car, into the chassis, during the restoration process. But in doing the restoration process and doing the research, I found out that this particular car was originally purchased by a guy in Detroit in the Detroit area as a kit, as a component, so not surprising there. And I actually talked to the guy, and he said, yeah, I drove it on the street for a little while, and then, with all the big cars in Detroit, it just didn't seem very sane to continue to drive it on the street. So I started racing it. And so he campaigned the car in SCCA from probably about 1966 or 1965 until the early 70s, and then he sold it. And it got sold to a guy in Chicago who continued to race it. But while it was in the Detroit area and raced, it was sponsored by Hush Puppy. And their shoes were that olive drab flock suede look. So this car was completely flocked, not flocked, really flocked, in olive drab with a big Hush Puppy sticker on the side. So that's part of its racing history, and it's kind of funny that you can imagine this car with olive drab flocking all over it. So I did the restoration, and then I drove it on the street for a while. Actually, drove it on the street quite a bit, and then I started doing vintage racing with it and autocrossing with it. So I sold the car to in about 1991 or so, to 92 maybe it was, to John Zender's dad. So it went to one of our club members, and he drove the car on the street for about the next 8 to 10 years. He actually painted this dark green, British green, racing green color. I always told John, and I told his dad Bob, that if there was ever an opportunity and they were interested in selling the car, please let me know. And that happened last year. So here it is. The car is back in my garage after being cared for about 18 years by Bob Zender. So we are doing a mechanical restoration on it now. The plan is to drive it on the street a little bit and then mostly use it for autocrossing. I think it was a great autocross car before, and I think it'll, we can do that again and have some fun with it, and maybe give some of the guys in the newer cars a little run for their money and show them what something old can do, like from 1963 can do.